I want to start with something small, something that, on its own, seems almost too mundane to mention. A river. Not a battle, not a buried palace, not a disappeared civilization, just a river. Or rather, the sudden, coordinated, government-mandated removal of what that river was called. What it had been called for centuries by everyone who lived beside it, drank from it, navigated it, and named their children near it. Here's what I kept coming back to, the deeper I went into this. Before you erase a civilization from memory, you don't need to drain the water. You don't need to reroute the channel, though we'll get to that too. You just need to change what a river is called. And if you do it fast enough, completely enough, and simultaneously enough, within a generation or two, nobody remembers what was there before. Nobody remembers what the water used to mean. And that is exactly what happened. Not gradually, not organically. Not through the slow linguistic drift that gives us the Thames. From the ancient Brythonic, Thamesis over the course of 1,000 years. No, I'm talking about single decrees, single colonial expeditions, entire river systems, spanning hundreds of miles, stripped of their names in coordinated sweeps during a narrow window of history. In 1607, English colonists arrived in Virginia. Within 3 years, the great river the Powhatan people had called Patawamek, a name woven into the fabric of the land itself, became the Potomac. The river they called Koyokohanok became the James. Not because anyone forgot the old names. Not because the old names were difficult to pronounce. But because a government, a colonial administration still wet from the Atlantic crossing, sat down and renamed them. Deliberately, completely, all at once. In the American Southwest, the river the Oodham called Semius. The river the Zuni had their own ancient name for. The river the Espesa del Norte, people had organized their entire civilization around for millennia, became the Rio Grande, the Grand River, named, apparently, by people who had just arrived, and France. France is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. During the revolutionary period of the 1790s, the same decade that saw cities like Lyon and Bordeaux stripped of their names by government decree, French cartographer took what historians blandly describe as a rationalization of waterway nomenclature. Over 2,000 river and stream names were rectified. 2 O's were reclassified, standardized, or outright replaced across French territory. 2,000 in a single administrative campaign. The official explanation is scientific modernization, the Enlightenment impulse to catalogue and systematize the natural world. And maybe that's all it is. But the coordination, the timing, the pattern, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me tell you what drew me to the rivers specifically, and why they matter more, I would argue, than the cities. Cities can be rebuilt. Cities can be renamed, and then, if the political winds shift, renamed again. We've watched that happen throughout the 20th century alone. Cities in Eastern Europe, cycling through German, Russian, and local names depending on who held power that decade. Cities are visible. Their renaming is at least documented. Rivers are different. Rivers are the infrastructure of civilization. They are how trade moved, how armies moved, how populations oriented themselves before any road, before any railway, before any of the infrastructure we associate with organized society. There was the river. And built into the name of every river was information where it came from, what it connected, and what civilization had built itself along its banks and understood it well enough to name it meaningfully. This raises a simple but critical question: why would you rename a river at all? Not rename a city that has obvious political utility, but a river. A river doesn't hold political office. A river doesn't carry a flag. A river just runs. So why, across multiple continents during a remarkably compressed period of history, roughly 1600 to 1900, do we see the same pattern of indigenous and pre-existing river names being stripped away and replaced by names that carry no geographic information, no cultural memory, no relationship to the landscape whatsoever? The James River, named for King James I, a king who never set foot in Virginia. The Rio Grande, named the Big River, in Spanish by people who called their own rivers, in Spain something else entirely. The Murray River in Australia, named in 1830 by Charles Sturt for Sir George Murray, the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, a man who had never been to Australia. The river already had names, multiple names from multiple Aboriginal peoples who had lived along its banks for 40,000 years. The deeper I looked, the more the official explanation, exploration, colonial administration, the practical need to put something on a map, began to strain under the weight of what it was being asked to explain. Because there's a difference between a map that names a river for the first time and a map that replaces a name that already existed. That distinction matters enormously, and in the historical record, that distinction is almost never made. If you've followed this channel for any length of time, you know that we keep returning to the same period, the same window, roughly 1700 to 1870, because that is when Tartary disappears from maps. Not fades, not gradually shrinks, disappears. Tartary, labelled on European maps as recently as the 1700s as a vast territory stretching across Central Asia and into Siberia, appearing on maps by cartographers in Amsterdam, Paris, London, and Venice, simply ceases to be named. The territory doesn't change. The land doesn't move. But the name vanishes from the cartographic record with a suddenness that professional historians struggle to fully account for. And what fills the space where Tartary was labelled? Rivers, river systems. The great rivers of Central Asia and Siberia, the Ob, the Irtysh, the Yenisei, the Lena, begin appearing on Western maps with new standardized, westernized names during precisely this period. River systems that local populations had named and navigated for centuries were being documented by Russian imperial cartographers and renamed as part of the same administrative expansion that was simultaneously erasing Tartary as a geographic label. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In 1552, Ivan the Terrible's conquest of Kazan began the Russian imperial push eastward. By the 1600s, Cossack expeditions were reaching the Pacific, and in their wake, in the administrative documents that followed the military campaigns, river after river received a new name, or received its first official name, which amounts to the same thing. The old name, the name that existed before, stops appearing in the records that survive. This raises a simple but critical question. Is this what normal colonial administration looks like, or does it look like something else? Something like an effort to sever the connection between a landscape and the civilization that had mapped it first. I'm not making a definitive claim here. I want to be careful about that. But I do want to ask the question, because the question itself is revealing. Here is where the investigation took a turn I wasn't expecting, because renaming a river solves one problem. It breaks the linguistic connection between the water and whatever civilization named it. But it creates another problem. The river is still there. It still runs through the city. People still fish it, cross it, dump their waste in it, build their neighborhoods beside it. The river is present, and a present thing, a visible, audible, sensory thing, is hard to make people forget. So what do you do when renaming isn't enough? You bury it. And here's the strangest part. Here is where I had to stop and sit with the data for a long time before I could continue. In London, between 1800 and 1900, a single century, 21 rivers were buried. 21. The Fleet, the Walbrook, the Tyburn, the Effra, the Westbourne, the Neckinger. Rivers with names, rivers with histories. Rivers that had shaped the city's geography, that appeared on maps going back centuries, that had given their names to neighborhoods and districts and roads. Gone, covered, converted to sewers, or simply entombed beneath new streets. The official explanation is sanitation. The Industrial Revolution had turned London's rivers into open sewers. The Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames became so foul that Parliament itself was forced to adjourn, prompted Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer Project. The rivers were buried for public health, and that explanation is partially true. I want to be honest about that. The rivers were polluted. They did smell. But 21 rivers in one century in one city. And the timing. The official explanation collapses here. Doesn't align neatly with the sanitation crisis at all. The Walbrook was buried well before the Great Stink. The Tyburn had been progressively culverted since the late 1700s. The process begins earlier than the sanitation narrative can account for, and it ends with something more complete than sanitation alone would require. You don't need to bury a river to manage its sewage. You need to treat its water, redirect its flow, and install infrastructure along its banks. Burial, complete, total, generational burial. To the point where Londoners today walk over rivers they don't know exist, is a different category of action. The Baie-Vray in Paris tells the same story. The river that ran through the left bank, that had powered tanneries and mills, that appeared on maps of Paris going back to the medieval period, was progressively buried through the 19th century and completely covered by 1912. The official explanation is again sanitation. The tanneries had made it toxic. But Paris didn't bury the Seine. Paris didn't bury the Marne. Paris buried the Baie-Vray, the smaller river, the one with the older history, the one that ran through neighborhoods that were being modernized in Haussmann's vast reshaping of the city in the 1850s and 60s. The same Haussmann project that demolished medieval Paris and replaced it with the boulevards you see today. The same project that coincides, with almost uncomfortable precision, with the disappearance of Tartaria from maps of the world. I want to be careful. I am not saying Haussmann was erasing Tartaria. I am saying the timing is a question I don't know how to answer. Moscow, 1812. Napoleon burns the city, or the Russians burn it themselves to deny him shelter. The historical debate continues. Either way, Moscow burns. And in the reconstruction that follows in the decade after, the city is rebuilt almost from scratch, and something happens to the Neglinaya River. The Neglinaya had run through the heart of Moscow for as long as Moscow existed. It ran along the western wall of the Kremlin. It had, according to some historical accounts, served as part of the city's early defensive system, a natural moat. It appeared on maps of Moscow. People lived beside it. In 1819, 7 years after the fire, the Neglinaya was buried completely, entombed in a brick culvert. Neglinaya Street, which now carries its name, is the only evidence it ever existed. The official explanation is flood control and urban modernization. The reconstruction of Moscow was a massive undertaking, and burying the river allowed new streets to be built across its former banks. But here's what I kept returning to. Why does reconstruction, consistently, in city after city, continent after continent, result not in incorporating rivers into the new urban fabric, but in eliminating them? Why is the river always what gets buried? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. A major disruption, war, revolution, fire, conquest, a period of reconstruction, and in that reconstruction, the river disappears. London after industrialization, Paris after Haussmann, Moscow after 1812. These are not isolated engineering decisions. These are a pattern, and patterns, in my experience, mean something. Not every river was renamed. Not every river was buried. And the ones that survived, the ones that kept their old names, that still run open through their cities, are, I think, the most revealing data point of all. Because look at which rivers survived. The Thames survived because it was too large, too central, too commercially vital to rename without economic catastrophe. The Seine survived for the same reason. The Ganges survived because the civilization along its banks never fully collapsed, never fully lost the institutional memory of what the river was called. The rivers that kept their names were the rivers that daily life made impossible to erase. The rivers where millions of people conducted commerce, drew water, and built their identities. The rivers that were, in the most practical sense, too expensive to forget. And the rivers that were renamed, rerouted, or buried. They were consistently the smaller rivers. The rivers of the interior, the rivers that ran through territories that had recently changed hands, that ran through cities in reconstruction, that ran through landscapes where the previous inhabitants had been reduced in number or influenced by war, disease, and displacement. This raises a simple but critical question. Is this pattern the result of practical, case engineering and administrative decisions, each made independently for local reasons? Or does the uniformity of the pattern suggest something more coordinated? Something that operated at a level above individual cities and individual governments? The evidence suggests something much larger. Not a conspiracy in the crude sense of the word, not a room full of men planning it, but a logic, a consistent, repeating logic that appears on multiple continents, in multiple languages, across multiple decades, always during the same narrow window of history, always serving the same function, severing the connection between a landscape and whatever civilization had understood it first. Let me be direct about why this matters. Let me lay out what I'm calling the coordination problem between approximately 1750 and 1900. The following things happened simultaneously across multiple continents in what historians describe as independent, unconnected processes. Indigenous river names are replaced across North America, South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia, not over centuries of organic linguistic shift, but in discrete colonial campaigns documented in administrative records. In France, over 2,000 waterway names are standardized in a single campaign. In England, a systematic culverting of urban rivers proceeds across London throughout the century. In Russia, the rivers of Siberia receive official Western cartographic names as Tartaria fades from maps. In Australia, Aboriginal river names attached to waterways that Aboriginal peoples had navigated for 40,000 years, are replaced within a generation of European arrival, and in the cartographic record, the maps, Tartaria vanishes, not the territory, the name. The label that had appeared on European maps for centuries, applied to a vast region of Eurasia, is removed from the cartographic vocabulary of the world during exactly this period. Not shifted, not disputed, not reclassified into smaller units. Removed. This is the coordination problem. How do you explain that level of consistency, that pattern repeating across languages and continents and decades, without some mechanism that produced it? The official explanation is that these were all independent processes driven by local conditions. Colonial administration required practical naming, sanitation required river burial, cartographic modernization required the removal of outdated labels, and maybe each individual case has an adequate local explanation. Maybe the James River really was named for administrative convenience, not to erase the Powhatan. Maybe the Neglinea really was buried because Moscow needed new streets. But all of them during the same century, following the same logic, producing the same result: a landscape scrubbed of its previous names, a cartographic record cleansed of its previous civilizational labels. You see, the official explanation collapses here, not because any single case is inexplicable, but because the pattern demands an explanation that no single case can provide. I want to close with something that has stayed with me since I began this investigation. Rivers were, for most of human history, the primary medium of communication, not roads, rivers. Trade moved by river, messages moved by river, armies moved by river. And built into the name of every river was a kind of compressed knowledge, geographic, cultural, historical. The name told you where the river came from, what it connected, and what civilization had understood it well enough to name it with meaning. When you rename a river, you don't just change what people call it. You erase that compressed knowledge. You break the chain of transmission between the civilization that understood the river and every civilization that comes after. And when you bury a river, when you put it underground, when you build streets over it, when you reduce it from a living waterway to a pipe beneath a pavement, you do something more profound still. You make it possible for people to live their entire lives above a river and never know it exists. You make forgetting not just possible, but inevitable. Here's what I want you to sit with. There are rivers beneath London that people walk over every day without knowing. There are rivers beneath Paris that haven't seen sunlight in over a century. There are rivers across North America whose original names survive only in the notes of a handful of linguists and the oral traditions of communities that were themselves nearly erased. And in the cartographic record, in that narrow window of history when all of this was happening, when rivers were being renamed and buried, and reclassified across the world. The name Tartary fades from the maps. Was Tartary a civilization that understood these rivers, that had named them, that had mapped them, that had built its knowledge of the landscape into the names it gave the water? I don't know. I can't know. The evidence that would answer that question is, by definition, the evidence that was removed. But this is what I find impossible to ignore: the same process. Renaming, then burying, then forgetting, was applied to rivers and to Tartary as simultaneously. The same logic, the same window. The same result: a landscape without a memory, a map without a prior civilization. A world in which the rivers have new names. The old rivers are underground, and the vast territory that once appeared on every map of the world is simply gone. Did it happen organically? Did it happen by accident? Did it happen because of sanitation and postal efficiency and colonial administration? Or did someone understand that the rivers were the memory, that as long as the rivers kept their names, the landscape kept its history, and act accordingly? The water is still there, beneath London, beneath Paris, beneath Moscow, running in the dark in the old channels, carrying whatever it carried before. It remembers. The question is whether we're allowed to.